Hello and welcome to our presentation titled Mission-Driven Hiring for Equity, Diversity, and Skills in Cultural Competency. Thank you for joining us. My name is Terry Jackson. I am Assistant Principal for Student Services at Loyola Academy in Chicago.
And I am Christina Vella. I'm the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Regis Jesuit School in Aurora, Colorado.
So we're just going to hop right in. Give you an overview of what we will be discussing with you. During this time, we will share why implementing hiring practices that involve seeking candidates from diverse backgrounds and candidates who have experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion work is critical to the mission of our schools and to the well-being of our communities.
So I'm going to spend a little bit of time first talking about our mission. Our mission as a Catholic school, and in our case specifically Jesuit schools, is what sets us apart from many other schools. As Catholic schools, we are not only interested in educating our students in book learning, we also want to educate them spiritually, emotionally, and personally. Respect for the dignity of each person is the core of Catholic social and moral teaching, and we want our students to see where this fits within their own lived experiences. We want them to leave our schools with a broader understanding of the different experiences, cultures, and perspectives that make up this world, and to recognize that we're called to honor and respect that diversity. And that's why our mission is based around this concept of cura personalis, or care for the individual, striving for the magis, striving for that more. We want our students to understand that the phrase men and with it, women with and for others is more than just a catchphrase. It's a way of life. It's a way of looking at the world. And so if we're called to accept the dignity of all, then our schools should be places where people are believed in, honored, and cared for, where natural talents and creative abilities are recognized and celebrated, where individual contributions and accomplishments are accepted, where everyone is treated fairly and justly, and where each of us finds the challenge, encouragement, and support that we need to be our fullest, to reach our fullest individual potential. And where all of this is attempted to model concretely, both in word and actions. We try to model that, all of these ideals that we uphold. So if these are the goals that we have, then obviously hiring for diversity is essential and integral to allowing us to fulfill our mission so that we're practicing what we preach and concretely putting those ideals into action, valuing the contribution as educators of teachers of color, placing emphasis on the importance of sharing personal perspectives from diverse backgrounds, and accepting the challenge to look at the world through a diverse lens. In order to recognize that, like exactly where we are in regards to animating this mission in this particular regard, we need to be able to take a look at our demographics. So we're going to use the Jesuit Schools Network numbers as a case study, since that's the demographic information that we have access to, and it shows things across the network and not necessarily just within an individual school. So a few definitions before we start going through this data. The data is broken up into 4 categories: students, as you see on the screen here, administration, which is our former school leadership positions. So for example, the principal, the president, the deans, assistant principals, etc. Faculty is our 3rd category, and these are people who spend most of their time teaching or working in the classroom directly with students. And then finally, staff. So our support staff, building and plant staff, and other non-teaching or non-leadership positions. So we're going to go back to the student, exactly. So our schools over the last few years have really increased the number of underrepresented students. As you can see from this first slide of demographics, we have about 43 to 44% of our students who come from non-white backgrounds. However, when we then look at the numbers for our employees and think about how these students are represented in the adults in our building, we might want to pause a little bit. Research has shown us that teachers of color don't just inspire and guide students of color to better academic outcomes. They benefit every student, preparing them to live and work in an increasingly diverse society. The Department of Education has noted similar findings, reporting that teachers of color are more likely to refer students of color to gifted programs, help students of color confront racism, advocate for students of color in the school system, develop trusting relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In an education system where students of color face barriers to educational success, and that's including in our own Catholic schools, It's important that we have teachers of color to help represent those students and help support them and help advocate them. It's critical. And when white students are exposed to greater diversity within their classroom, research has also showed us that they are able to address topics like race, bias, racism and bias, and gain a deeper level of appreciation for people of different cultures, different ethnicities, and different backgrounds, all of which is going to help us get to our goal of inspiring our students to recognize the dignity of every person. So to get back to the numbers, if you take a look at our administrators, you'll see that we have about 23.7% of our administrators who come from diverse backgrounds, which is a very different, it's about half of our students at 43 to 44%. Our teachers are even less than that. Our teachers are at about 20.6% students of color. And our staff, which is where you'll see the largest actual discrepancy amongst our different schools, our staff is at 34.7%. And the reason that you'll see the most discrepancy here is because this depends on the makeup of schools. For example, some schools have our janitorial staff contracted, whereas others have them as direct employees. And unfortunately, that's where oftentimes a lot of the diversity falls. So in all of this, you don't see the same sort of diversity that you do within our students. So we can hopefully at least have as our goal to reflect our student body, right?
Absolutely. So one of the things that Chris was mentioning is how important this is, really diversifying our faculty, staff, and administrative population. How important that is for our students of color, our underrepresented students, and how equally important it is for our white students. And on my first day at Loyola Academy, I had one of our Black female students approach me, and she said, "You don't know how important it is that you are here for us." And I said, "Well, yes, I do. I know how important it is for you and other students of color, but I also know how important it is that how my representation matters for our white students." So we are wanting all of our students to be culturally competent and to diversify their interactions and engagements from our diverse communities. And to increase that diverse community means that we have these mirrors, windows, and doors for all students. In her TED Talk, in which she poses the question, should we strive to be colorblind or color brave? Melody Hobson, who is a graduate of St. Ignatius College Prep here in Chicago, states that most people might think it's strange for a company to have all Black board members. And I pause for a reason. She asked her audience to ponder over this thought: when will we think it's weird to walk into a room where all of the board members of a company are white? I would argue that we should be asking ourselves the same question about our schools. Why is it okay for us to have all white or majority white board members and faculty and staff members? What message are we sending to our current and prospective families, students, and teachers and staff members of color? And what message are we sending to all of our members? So it no longer makes sense to hire faculty, administrators, or staff members who are unable to effectively, respectfully, thoughtfully, and inclusively work with, teach, and or lead diverse groups of people. These are the people who are crafting the culture and climate of our schools. So if we're talking about hiring for skills and cultural competency and why diversity matters, as Chris has mentioned, we're always in consideration of our mission and our core values. So doing so, hiring for skills and cultural competence, hiring more diverse members of our community, really animate and bring to life our core values. An argument that we have heard, or I have heard, is that we're being political, but I want to emphasize that it is not political. Again, tying it to our mission and to our core values. It is not political. It's about making sure that what we say and what we do aligns with who we are and who we say we are. So making sure that our espoused values, those things that are written on our websites, on our pamphlets, on our walls, align with our enacted values, what we do each and every day. So we are a global network with a universal mission, and I will not reiterate that which Chris has shared with you, but we can elucidate this more during our virtual Q&A session that I hope everyone participates in, joins in. So what are the effects? What are the consequences? I mentioned that, you know, there are consequences or indirect messages, unintentional messages that we are sending to our community, the people of color within our community, but also to all of our community members. So it is important to realize that ignoring cultural competencies in the hiring process is not a neutral act. This neglect or omission has damaging consequences and sends messages that, although might feel unintentional, we can talk about intent versus impact. They might feel unintentional, but they have a negative impact on the current and potential community members that feel, look, or might be perceived as intentional. It demonstrates to those seeking employment in our schools that we do not consider the development and maintenance of equity as a shared responsibility, but rather one that rests on the shoulders of a few. By undervaluing cultural competency and not including it in any substantial way in the hiring process, we are likely to miss opportunities to hire those who have worked hard to develop skills in that area, which would fulfill our mission. They're unlikely to apply for positions in our schools that we're showing that we're not supporting our mission in the hiring process. So those are the damaging consequences and messages that we're sending to those individuals who are seeking employment in our schools. But we're also sending damaging messages to our DEI practitioners in our community who are maybe feeling fatigue, because again, it seems as though the message that we're sending is that work that is critical to our mission rests in the hands or the shoulders of a few. And to our families and students of color, we send the message that we see no value in providing mirrors for them to see themselves in their teachers and in their administrators. That should they desire to become a faculty member or administrator in our institutions, that there's no space and no place for them. And I would venture to guess that that is not a message that we desire to send. So cultural competencies, like when we're talking about hiring for cultural competence, sometimes again, we feel like, okay, that is a trait, a skill that we need to see in our faculty members and our administrators, and maybe not our staff members. That is untrue. Cultural competency is integral to all positions. So this knowledge and skills related to cultural competence are integral to building inclusive and equitable teaching and learning environments, and are therefore critical to every member of the community.
All of our employees interact with students on some level, and therefore it is completely essential that they all recognize that this is important for all of them. And this is not just the role of a diversity practitioner. This is not just the role of like one person who is specifically hired in order to fulfill the cultural competent category. No, this is something that everybody needs to participate in.
So some questions that you might consider is, have our current hiring practices improved our ability to serve all members of our community? Are they bringing voices, knowledge, and skills into the school that have increased our ability to critically examine policies, programs, procedures, pedagogy, practices? Have they increased our ability to create equitable, truly inclusive learning and working spaces? Or have they made no discernible difference in diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in our schools? So here's an indicator alert. we have this big stop sign here, and it's stop hiring yourself. If you have a deficit when it comes to cultural competence, if there is something that a skill or knowledge that you are lacking, we should refrain. We should not be hiring individuals who have those same deficits. So other questions that we might be asking is, what do our job descriptions look like? What do our advertisements look like? Where are we posting vacant job descriptions? Who is involved in the hiring process? What sort of training do those involved in that process go through before sitting on a committee, on a search committee, on a hiring committee? And then who is the gatekeeper of applications and resumes, and how many people are in this role? It is super, super important, again, that we stop hiring ourselves, that we do a little bit of research so that we do not have trouble attracting and retaining candidates that bring these very specific experience in our working environments, in our schools.
So some might ask, do we really need a policy for this? Can't we just put this into practice? Perhaps, but it is even more challenging to think about this without a policy. And the reason for that is because this needs to be our way of proceeding. If we're really dedicated to our mission, and that includes diversifying our faculty, then this needs to be institutional. It can't be the pet project of any one person. It needs instead to literally be part of the institutional structure. And a policy is going to help us do that. It also needs to include more than just one person. At Regis Jesuit, we sat down and we took a look at our hiring policy with the goal of hiring a more diverse faculty. And we realized that updating our policy to a more equitable policy not only helped our goal of hiring more faculty of color, it helped our entire process for every candidate. It's essential to think about who's going to be included, who in your community has the ability to make decisions, to push things to change, who can represent your target audience to assist in counsel, who can take this to the board and to the board of trustees and to the president to make sure that they know what's happening and are supportive. So in order to rewrite the policy, there needs to be a willingness to have some of these deep discussions and an openness to set aside the way it's always worked or the way we've always done it. You can't rewrite the policy and then just continue to hire grads or continue to hire people that the administration knows or to hire people from the same pool. You really need to be able to look at the bias that's involved. And then procedurally, once we have the policy written, we have to figure out, what does this lived experience look like? As Terry mentioned, who's the gatekeeper? Who's on the interview team? How do you get past, but we want to hire the best candidate? How do you make sure you are hiring the best candidate? All of these are questions that need to be asked and answered. And that's why this isn't just a one meeting endeavor, and it needs to be involved in a whole policy rethink.
And really challenging our perception of good fit.
Absolutely, absolutely. So our policy rewrite was a 2.5 year process. And our final makes sure that there's not only one gatekeeper who looks at applications, but rather a committee. And that committee doesn't just look at every application for a position, it also hires and decides on a final candidate to present to the principal. You see here a list of all the people who are involved in the hiring process at Regis. The committee really has to have a diverse makeup in order to have every lens represented. The lens of the ability to teach, the lens of the content understanding, the lens of that diverse understanding. So whether they're culturally competent or a diverse candidate or have experience in working with diverse populations, there are many different things that could fall into that, right? There's going to be a slightly different configuration depending on, are we hiring for the business office or are we hiring for faculty? What position are we hiring for? But basically, we have the HR director who's behind the scenes, making sure that the policy is followed and is serving as the one that passes on the resumes to everyone. She is not the sole gatekeeper for resumes, but she's just running the application program that we use in order to send things to the rest of us. The president or the principal, depending on who we're hiring, are they faculty or are they central administration? They're going to have the final say, but they're not necessarily going to be involved in every single interview process just because we have a lot of interviews. The hiring manager is the one who is part of the administration who's in charge of a particular hiring committee. So let's say we're hiring for a math position. We'll have someone who is part of the administration, an assistant principal who's in charge of this particular hiring committee, and is the one who's going to have direct communication with the HR director. Then we have a department chair who's going to be the representative for the department. We have the diversity representative who is one of our diversity team or someone that we have indicated to be that representative. And then finally, we have a content specific person. So if it's a math teacher, for example, we have someone who can make sure that they are really good at teaching trigonometry, right? If that's necessary. We don't pretend that everybody on campus could automatically fill all of these roles. So for us, training is really, really important. We made sure that training was involved. We had to make sure that the hiring managers, that the representatives, that everybody was trained. Why? Because if we're hiring for diversity, they need to understand why it's part of the mission, number one. But number two, we also need to be made aware of what biases we are bringing into this. So we sent everybody through implicit bias training, recognizing that some of the things that are biases for us that we really need to think about are the Catholic bias. Like, are we only looking at teachers who are coming to us who are Catholic? We have to look at the grad bias. We like to hire graduates to come back and teach at our schools. If they have Jesuit or Catholic schooling in their past, we're definitely going to have a bias towards them. That fit bias, as Terry mentioned, we can't just talk about, oh, it just feels right. We need to get beyond that, right? This team is also going to take a look at the interview questions and think about how are we framing cultural competency in these questions? And Terry's going to get to this in just a second. And then post-interview, we need to talk about that again, how is my bias fitting in? So even if you're not ready to do an entirely new policy because you don't have the ability to push through that particular work, there are other good places to start. Where you're posting, how you read the applications, and the questions that you ask in the interview. So we're going to talk a little bit about each of these steps.
So with regard to posting, answering the question, where are we getting our applicants? There's an old adage that says, if we always do what we've always done, we'll always get what we've always done. So again, hiring ourselves and not diversifying our candidates or our hires. So all too often I hear that we aren't attracting diverse candidates, or there aren't enough diverse fill in the blank out there, teachers, administrators, staff members, whatever it may be. But we need to take a moment of self-reflection and ask ourselves, where are we posting? Is it serving our mission and goals? Do we need to rethink? And so many of our schools have a long history. We've been around for a long time, and we fall into the pit of tradition. This is the way we've always done it. But if the way we've always done it is not ending in the results that we desire, that our community needs, then we need to switch it up a bit. And so there are so many organizations that are committed to helping schools find diverse candidates, StrataGenius, NEMNet, and we can share more of those during our Q&A session. But these are things that we have to consider. Where are we getting our applicants?
We also have to think about how we read the applications. We can't just look at the content knowledge, but we also have to look to see what else the person could bring to our community. Looking at alternative experiences. What are some other clubs or organizations that they're involved in that show us their outside experiences that they might be able to bring with them to our community, and so on. How can we place value on some of these other alternative ways of educating ourselves that allow us to bring in diverse ways of thinking, and as Terry has mentioned, not continue to hire ourselves.
Ready to move on?
Yeah.
Okay. And then we talk about the interviewing process. So we get to this point. We've done our best to diversify the places that we've posted. We're working on reviewing the applications, the resumes, realizing what our implicit biases are, and having a search committee, a hiring committee that brings so many pieces to, disparate pieces to the process. So we need to ask ourselves when we sit down, before we sit down, what do our questions look like? We must use the interviewing process as an opportunity to bring in new faculty, staff, administrators who will help us again fulfill our mission and to live our core values. So I'm just going to take you through, like, rather quickly how we formulate questions to gauge a candidate's skills, knowledge, and experience. We want to be thoughtful, we want to be intentional that the questions that we create, that we draft, lend themselves to candidates sharing their knowledge, skills, and experience rather than their attitudes and beliefs. And there's a very good reason why I'm emphasizing these knowledge, skills, and experience rather than the attitudes and beliefs. Because we would be unlikely, I wouldn't say we wouldn't, we would be unlikely to hire a teacher just because the person believes that teaching is important. In the absence of any data that tells us that this person can develop curriculum, design pedagogy, and interact with students in ways that help all students learn. That's an unlikely situation that we would hire such a candidate. We would not hire a president or a principal simply because he or she likes to work in leadership. In the absence of any substantial evidence and experience that demonstrate that he or she has the skills needed to handle complex tasks. So it shouldn't be okay to simply ask candidates to define diversity, or if they believe equity and inclusion should be considered in the classroom, or to simply describe how diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts affect the school's mission or affect the decision-making process. So it is important for us to be mindful that when we set out to include cultural competence in our hiring practice, that our line of questions, again, our interview questions, are formulated as such that they place emphasis on a candidate's knowledge, skills, and experience. So we're not asking questions, the attitude and belief questions look and sound like, do you think considering diversity in the classroom is important? Or we might ask, or we shouldn't ask, define diversity and identify 2 ways diversity affects the mission of a Catholic Jesuit school. Instead, if we're seeking to discover skills, knowledge, and experience, we would ask a candidate for a faculty position, please describe a time when issues of race, ethnicity, gender, and or socioeconomic status have come up in the class you were teaching. And we would have follow-up questions that would lend themselves to the candidate going into detail as to, what was the context of the issue? Was it raised by a student or was it raised by you? How did you handle the issue at that time? And from your point of view, what were the learning outcomes from this situation? And we might even ask, what did you learn from this? And if you were put in a similar situation in the future, what would you do differently? Another example, and we will gladly share more, but I just wanted to give you a sample, is please provide us with 2 examples of when you were in leadership positions and you were involved in reviewing and revising policies, procedures, and practices in order to improve equity and inclusion in a school setting. So this might be a question that we would ask someone who is interviewing for an administrative position. Really, and the follow-up could be similar to the previous question to just get into more detail. And we want to see how, in the moment, like, how are you responding to what you learned from that situation and how you would bring the similar skills and knowledge to our school.
So once the candidate walks out of the room, that's when the decision gets made, right? We all still have walked into the room with our biases, even if we are aware of them, even if we've been trained on them. And it can be really challenging, especially during the hiring season, when there's a sense of urgency to fill a position, to not let those biases lead us. And so that's why at Regis Jesuit, we came up with a rubric for reading the applications and for the interviews. It offers us a little bit more of an objective way to say, I heard the candidate express their knowledge in the subject matter when he said this, or the candidate shared their understanding of our mission when she said this. Each of these categories that I have listed here on the slide gives us the chance to hear about the candidate's experience. And we, as members of the interview team, listening from our diverse lenses, can also then offer us, it will offer us a starting point to be able to have our discussions after the interview. So it's really important to think, if our students are 44% more or less, our students look like this, we want them to be represented by the adults in our building. It's not necessarily just about the theory, right? It's about really putting our mission into action and saying, we want these kids to have advocates and to have support all the time. We want our white students to have a diverse view of the world. So really, how are we putting that mission into action?
Right, and I think about, as we're talking about how this is mission driven, but as Chris has mentioned, we should also think about how it is student centered. So we thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. You've got our contact information here, so please feel free to reach out to us with any sort of questions on cultural competency or the work that we've done in implementing our hiring policy and the things that we continue to do now that it's in place. We didn't just write a policy and then walk away from it. We're continuously tweaking it and thinking about how we can make it better and make it work for us, right? We're very willing to engage in those conversations. And to that point,
join us for the roundtable discussion on Monday, October 19th, and the times are here.
So thank you so much. Thank you for listening.
Good one.